Within the concept of employer-employee and agency relationships, after it's established that there is an employee and not an independent contractor, to hold the principal responsible for the torts of the agent, we're going to have to establish something else. So now, not only do we have to know we have an employee, but we also have to know that the employee was acting within the scope of their employment, and that's going to be within the time and geographical location of their employment. If you think about it, you're really also looking at the mental state of the agent. Is the agent acting with a mindset of the employer and achieving the employer's objectives, or is the employee acting for themselves? Because if you think about it, that would go, if they're acting for themselves, against the duty of loyalty and would be a breach of their agency relationship anyway. So the typical areas where you have to investigate scope of employment would be in when are they working and when are they not. So let's take an example. So let's say we work here in Lebanon, and we have an office up in State College. And so we have this other location, and I need to go there. I want you to go there as my agent to work for a day. So on your trip, if you find the most direct route from here to there, and you're in your car driving along that stretch, you're in your scope of employment because I've instructed you to go there. You're taking a direct route. So let's say you decide, hey, there's this great site that I've always wanted to see. So on your way up there, you divert off the highway, you go see that site, and you actually have your tort. You hit somebody in your car while you're there. That's not in my jurisdiction. You were doing something for yourself, not engaging in activities for me. You took a detour. That doesn't mean that if, say, there's road construction on the road or traffic and you find an alternate route because it's going to get you to the location faster, that you put yourself outside the scope of employment. That's not true. If you are still mentally doing my work trying to get to my location, then you'll be okay. Another aspect would be if you are on the way up there and it happens to be lunchtime and you get off the road to go eat lunch, that's not going to take you out of the scope of employment. You're still in it because it's natural and reasonable for an employee to seek to get lunch if it's that time of day while you're engaging otherwise in the actions for the employer. Now, if, however, you go off and you have a liquid lunch and things get a little out of hand, that would not be part of the deal. So you would, at that moment, be working for yourself and take yourself out of the scope of employment, releasing the employer from the liability for your actions. So continuing this discussion, we do have to look at whether or not the employee's action was an intentional tort. If it's an unintentional tort, then if the employee is within the scope of their employment, then the employer will be liable for that tort. If, however, it's found that the tort is intentional, then the employer will be relieved from the obligation of that action. So essentially, an intentional act notes that the employee has taken themselves mentally out of the work of the employer because that was not the intention of the employer to commit an intentional act. And so it removes you from the scope of employment. So it's very consistent with the theory involved here. So let's say that the reason that you have to go to the location up in State College is because this is the 8th time this month that the manager of that location lost their keys. And so you running up there for the 8th time to provide your keys. So you get there and, the guy's behind you and you open the door and you've had enough and you turn around, pow, and you punch him in his face. Right? Well, that is an intentional tort. I did not instruct you to punch him in his face. As much as he was annoying to me as he is to you, that is still an intentional tort on your part, and therefore I, as the employer, would not be liable for those actions. So there's a fine point in here, however, because let's take an example of where I have my bouncer, Bubba, for my nightclub. And so every night I bring Bubba in the back room and I say, "Come here, Bubba, it's time for your shot." And he goes, "Ugh." And so he bends over and I take out my steroids and stick him. And he goes, "Ugh." And I say, "Are you ready, Bubba?" And he goes, "Oh," and I smack him, pow, pow, pow. And I go, "I said, are you ready?" And he says, "Oh," and out he goes, right? And he takes the first knucklehead who comes to the door and he picks him up and he throws him out because he cut the line. Well, that is an intentional tort on Bubba's behalf. However, because I, the employer, did something to engage that behavior, his view really is that I mean for him to do those intentional torts as part of his job. And therefore, that's an exception where the intentional tort would leave him in the scope of employment, and I would be found liable for that tort.